All right, AP Human Geography students, welcome back to another lecture. This one's starting us off for our Cities and Urban Land Use unit. This will be the first of a couple lectures I'll make as we wrap up our course here, okay? All I'm trying to focus on in this one is sort of a baseline understanding, a few definitions of what cities are, terms like urbanization, suburbanization, exurbation, the site and situation characteristics of cities, and then finishing up with a look at a couple examples of urban hierarchies, right? How you might define different sizes of cities and rank them against each other. So let's get started. Starting with definition, okay? We need to start by defining exactly what we mean when we're discussing cities and urban areas. These terms are closely related, but what exactly is the difference between urban and city? All right. The definition I've got here says for urban, we're referring to the entire built-up non-rural area and its population, including the most recently constructed suburban appendages. So basically, urban is more of a reference to how the land has been changed or used as a built-up area and center of services, industry, and housing. When thinking about cities, many people often picture the urban environment of their locality more than they think about the actual sort of legal boundaries of their city. This brings us to the definition of a city, right? So the definition I've got here says a city is a conglomeration of people and buildings clustered together to serve as a center of politics, culture, and economics. So put simply, a city for a geographer is all the territory inside of officially recognized boundaries, as you might see on a map. A definition like this, one that's based on boundaries, is useful for determining precise population, taxation, the enforcement of certain rules or laws, etc. In reality, though, a person walking on the ground through a large city won't see the boundaries very often that delineate the borders of a city and can walk from one city to another while the urban environment around them never changes. It might sound weird to you, but imagine walking from Henderson to North Las Vegas, all right? Moving along, I don't know, whatever, like Boulder Highway or along the freeway or something like that. You could go from, Henderson to Las Vegas, to North Las Vegas, without ever really getting the impression that you were in a new, distinct city, right? And this is kind of the difference between a city and an urban area, right? All of the area from Henderson to Las Vegas to North Las Vegas is one consistent urban area, right? It's all built up. It's not rural. It's got buildings and suburbs and all that stuff. But technically, those are three distinct cities, right, that have a legal kind of official incorporation that defines them as a distinct place. But there are still other ways to define and characterize cities in addition to the legal boundaries. Urban areas can be thought of in terms of the amenities that they contain. Urban areas are often nucleated, as in they have a nucleus, right, a core area. This city core is often referred to as the CBD, or the Central Business District, which you've started to read about, I believe, if you've begun your chapter. As we'll learn about later in this unit, though, the CBD is a center very often for non-agricultural jobs and services, a lot of consumer services, for example, like department stores, universities, hospitals, hotels. All of these might be found clustering or agglomerating in the core of an urban area. Business services also can be found in these core areas, these CBDs, things like law offices, financial services, the headquarters of certain banks, custodial services that might, clean these other businesses or maintain them in other ways, can all be found operating out of these urban nuclei or CBDs. And then finally, public services, right? Whether they're police or fire departments, especially the headquarters, of certain police and fire departments might be found in a city center. Federal and state government buildings like courthouses or city hall can be found in the core areas of of cities. And we'll kind of discuss more on why exactly these things will cluster in the CBD in another lecture when we talk about central place theory and central business districts and all that. Additionally, cities can be defined in terms of their characteristics, right? Their social characteristics. Lewis Wirth is an American sociologist you read about in chapter 12, a guy from the mid-20th century that discussed cities in just this way, in terms of their characteristics, particularly the characteristics most likely to affect the social interactions of people. So he looked at, cities as being defined particularly by their large size, right? And that this large size of cities often reduced the intensity and friendliness of interactions between individuals. That most relationships and interactions in a city on a day-to-day basis would be what Lewis Wirth called contractual, right? That you're talking to someone in order to order your coffee or your burger, to pay the bridge toll, or to buy admission into the theater or something like that, right? Compare this to a small rural town where Lewis Wirth thought, cities in comparison lacked some of the humanity and friendliness found in rural communities where everyone sort of knew each other, right? And you were interacted more than just in passing. Wirth also talked about the high density of cities, right? That the crowded conditions of cities would lead to increased competition between the occupants of a city, competition for parking, competition for, room on the road of a freeway, for seats in a restaurant, for jobs, for apartments and housing, for a spot in line at the grocery store, etc. And that all those things would, in general, also kind of wear at the social interactions between people and more rigidly start to kind of segregate social classes and things like that from each other. On the upside, though, Wirth argued that cities were also centers of social heterogeneity or differences. He thought, correctly really, that most cities were very diverse places, and that this diversity would allow much more freedom of profession, sexual orientation, and cultural interest. Right? Because cities are centers for immigration, and there's often enough people in very large cities that many very specific communities could form and people could feel more comfortable being themselves, as opposed to smaller communities where it might be harder for a woman to work certain jobs, or for a support community for LGBT people to thrive, or a worship center for a minority religion to be constructed. In a large city, you could find significant communities for all of those groups. Now, Wirth's ideas today, still apply in a lot of ways, but are definitely more applicable to LDCs than to MDCs. As typically most people in MDCs hold, more or less urban jobs in the secondary or tertiary sector, and very few people at all in MDCs work in agriculture anymore, right? Just 1% or so, 1 or 2% in the United States are involved in agriculture. So there's not a giant distinction between city people and rural people there, right? It's not like everybody in rural areas are farmers. Also, things like cars, cell phones, TV, high-speed internet, fast food, and other things like that make the difference between city and rural life less distinct, right? As you can find McDonald's and good cell phone service and internet in basically any community in an MDC, right? In the United States, we use the term metropolitan statistical area and also micropolitan statistical area as additional definitions when talking about cities. And these are much more specific. A metropolitan area is basically like the example I was talking about earlier, where one legally defined city bumps right into another legally defined city, like walking from Henderson to Las Vegas to North Las Vegas, right? That's a metropolitan area. A metropolitan statistical area is this, but it's a little broader. It's a little larger in size and a little larger in what's included. It refers to the central city that has a population of at least 50,000, but often a lot more than this. So let's say, Las Vegas or something. And all its immediately interacting counties, right? Not just communities, but counties. Like we live in Clark County. The nearby counties that have lots of people working within the core city, right, or commuting or interacting there to buy groceries or use other services, go to the courthouse or the DMV or talk to a lawyer or whatever, but people that are, frequently connected with and interacting with that central city would help that county to be included as part of the MSA, as part of the Metropolitan Statistical Area. Sometimes, and we'll talk about this in another lecture as well, but sometimes the boundaries of several MSAs will overlap as well, producing what are known as conurbations or megalopolises, all right? We'll talk about that, like I said, later on in the lecture here. A micropolitan statistical area is basically the same thing in every way, just smaller, right? The big difference being that the core city only has to be between 10 and 50,000 people. So let's look at some examples here, right? These maps show examples of what we are talking about here. The map on the left shows the Las Vegas Valley and the various communities and cities that make up the Las Vegas metropolitan area. Only Las Vegas, Henderson, and North Las Vegas are, sort of full cities though. While communities like Summerlin, Blue Diamond, Whitney, Winchester, Paradise, these places are unincorporated cities, a slightly less official designation, right? But they would all have, sort of city councils, sort of plan their communities separate from each other and so on. On the right is the Las Vegas MSA, right? The Las Vegas Metropolitan Statistical Area, which you can see includes all of Clark County, as well as places like Mojave in Arizona, parts of San Bernardino County in California, because remember, the Metropolitan Statistical Area boundary is based on the kind of frequency and intensity of interaction with the core city. So those communities in Arizona or California that are very strongly connected to Las Vegas can be included in that MSA definition. This map from your textbook of St. Louis and the St. Louis MSA is a great representation of the various boundaries and defined areas a city can have. The red area in the center shows the legally defined boundaries of St. Louis as a city, right? While the yellow represents the urbanized area, but like with Las Vegas, probably includes several other legally defined cities, but the urban areas all kind of blend into one another, right? The purple shows the cities and counties included in the St. Louis MSA, right? Where those people are commuting in and out of that city on a regular basis. Finally, this map shows the distribution of metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas across the United States, which you can see has a strong correlation to, what you would see on a population density map, right? There's more MSAs where there's more concentrations of people. Cities are often founded with strong considerations for both site and situation. Remember that site refers to the distinct environmental conditions in an area, and situation refers to the relative location of other places and things. Pause for a moment and see if you can think of a few site and situation considerations that would be important to someone founding a city. Let's see how our ideas compare here, okay? When it comes to site considerations, cities have historically been founded in areas that are easy to defend, especially in older cities. Ideal spots might be near rivers or coastlines that might give you advantages to trade and commerce. Things like climate and soil and weather all impact the ability of a community to feed itself in addition to being comfortable, while elevation and topography can come into play as a city expands or tries to attract new members and might bump up against, the elevation it's built on, the topography of the surrounding area. Another thing to remember here is that site generally doesn't change, right? If you're next to a river when the city is founded, you're probably next to a river a couple hundred years later, right? If the soil wasn't very good when you started the city, it's probably not very good a couple hundred years later. Situation, once again, refers to sort of your relative location or where your city is relative to other cities and locations. And it's a little different in that it does change frequently over time, right? As cities become more or less important and so on. Situational considerations for a city could include its proximity, its nearness to other cities or markets and trade routes. Like, today we would think of maybe trade routes like railways, freeways, ports, and so on. Maybe its proximity to resources like agricultural products, water sources, energy sources might all be considered as a city is founded or as you try to sustain it in the future. Where are you going to kind of get these things from? But, maybe even other resources too, in addition to water, food, energy, depending on whatever the kind of basic industry of the community is, right? You might want to be close to other resources you're going to be frequently dependent on or importing. The growth of cities can be described using a few distinct terms that refer basically to where the change in population is happening, okay? Urbanization, one of our vocab words, refers to the growth and diffusion of a city landscape or lifestyle. Or it refers to the process by which the population of an urban settlement grows, right? You might say in areas experiencing urbanization if a city is growing, right? Most MDCs are highly urbanized, but LDCs have been undergoing massive amounts of urbanization over the last few decades, and in fact contain more of the world's largest cities and fastest growing cities than a lot of MDCs do. Suburbanization is specific to, well, what a suburb is, right? A suburb is a mostly residential area, mostly a place, mostly housing, adjacent to an urban area, these kind of urban cores of services and so on. So suburbanization refers to the movement of people from cities to residential areas, or these suburbs on the outskirts of cities. Oftentimes, suburbs tend to be a lot less heterogeneous, right? They're a lot less diverse ethnically and socioeconomically, and less densely populated than communities found in urban areas. Finally, exurbation, sometimes it's known, for example, on our vocab as counter-urbanization, is when people leave urban and suburban areas altogether for more rural areas, right? They travel out even beyond the suburbs and move from a city to a rural area. And this kind of movement is facilitated today by modern telecommunications. Again, how many people are in the era of COVID, going to work entirely online and stuff, right? You can work from home anywhere in the country nowadays. Finally, we can get to kind of talking about these urban hierarchies, all right? We'll use some of these definitions we've discussed here to talk about urban hierarchies. This is the idea that in a developed country with an evenly distributed population, there will be a kind of hierarchy of evenly spread central places to provide services to the population across a large region. Like any hierarchy, the expectation is that there will be relatively few cities of the largest size and increasingly more settlements as you move down the hierarchy to smaller communities. This makes sense in terms of central place theory, which, like I said, we'll discuss in another lecture. But to put it briefly, services have ranges and thresholds, right? A range being a distance at which people will or won't be willing to travel for a service, and threshold being a certain amount of people or customers needed to keep the service in business, basically, right, is what a threshold is. So services like Broadway or, Wall Street that require, enormous networks of support, educated or trained individuals, access to multiple other companies of, similar forms, are really only going to be found in very large cities like, New York City, for example, who could guarantee access to all these kinds of things, right? While smaller services, right, gas stations, fast foods, right, any city can basically support the infrastructure needed to maintain a gas station or a McDonald's or something, right? So thinking about cities in terms of an urban hierarchy is helpful because it's really going to encourage us to think of cities as the centers of services, which is really kind of the theme of this unit, right? That cities are the central places where services are nested and located. A typical urban hierarchy is going to look something like this, okay? Although some of these, obviously these names might vary depending on where you are in the world. But some common ones that you might see on an AP test or, throughout the United States or in parts of Europe would be maybe a very small community, sometimes referred to as a hamlet, generally a few dozen people, right? A very, the smallest of communities, a limited amount of services present. Above a hamlet, you would have villages where you see slightly more services, maybe post office, grocery store, things like that. Towns, which generally are somewhere between, 50 people to a few thousand people, and, technically might count as an urban area, but are smaller than a city, right, in terms of population and kind of like land area covered. A city is going to be an area consisting of generally tens of thousands of people, right? Almost like when you think about a micropolitan statistical area, right? You're going to want between 10, 50,000 people or so to make up a small city, where you're going to, in general, also have people kind of more densely packed in. Go off on a tangent on a story there. A metropolis is when you get well beyond the scale of a city, right? A city is going to include sort of these tens of thousands of people up to, maybe several 100,000 people or something, while a metropolis, at a minimum, is going to be, almost again like a metropolitan statistical area, right? It's going to have at least some core area of 50,000 people, although it often has a lot more than that if we're calling it a metropolis. But again, like the best thing to think of is like an MSA, right? Where you've got this very large population, very large land area, all centered around some kind of core city is a metropolis. A megalopolis, we'll kind of talk about specifically here again in a moment, sometimes called a conurbation, would be when you have kind of several metropolitan areas linked together, right? Several sort of overlapping metropolises or MSAs all connected together, right? Making a megalopolis. The big example and one of the kind of earliest named examples of a conurbation or a megalopolis is the area between Boston and Washington, D.C. on the East Coast, called the Boswash Corridor, is one kind of unbroken chain of urbanized area, right? And like going from Henderson to North Las Vegas, which is not a very big area, you have a similar situation going from Boston to, New York City, to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, to Washington, D.C., which is a couple hundred miles or so, right? But that is all so densely populated and urbanized that it looks like one consistent city. Again, similar to like walking from North Las Vegas to Henderson, only this is over a much larger area. Some examples, what a hamlet might look like, a little village, something closer to a city, this being a, kind of nice looking European city here, or town, excuse me. Larger cities, maybe a metropolis here, and then the Boswash corridor, right? This conurbation that covers a huge chunk of the East Coast and is very densely populated, right? Something like 50 million people live throughout that area. These conurbations or megalopolises, right, a bunch of these are shown on this map. The term itself, megalopolis, goes back to the early 1900s and is really popularized by this French geographer, Jean Gottman, who is the first person to kind of refer to that Boswash corridor as that. And he calls it the Boswash corridor. That chain of connected cities going from, like I said, Boston through New York and Philadelphia, all the way to Baltimore and Washington, D.C., this mega region that has 50 million something people in it. But as the world continues to grow in population and continues to urbanize, there are more of these mega regions or megalopolises or conurbations that are popping up, right? Where cities are basically growing to form a single conurbation, right? This single uninterrupted urban area. And this can be even, a little different even than an MSA, really, when you boil it down. An MSA, remember, is going to be based on like a single urban center. And in a conurbation, although cities kind of remain legally distinct from each other, there and their suburbs kind of become this sort of single region that takes on a lot of the characteristics of a massive city, right? Even though the cities themselves are still kind of legally distinct. Since 1961, when that French geographer Jean Gottman first referred to the Boswash corridor as a megalopolis and conurbation, there's been a bunch more of these, right? As you can see throughout the United States, some of the other big ones being like the growing conurbation between Los Angeles and San Diego on the West Coast. And then, there's others even globally, a bunch of them in China. Probably one of the largest in the world being the Tokyo to Yokohama conurbation that includes, again, another like tens of millions of people clustered in that one spot. So another sort of visualization of these urban hierarchies, right? The big idea being that, as you move up this hierarchy, you're going to see fewer and fewer of these, right? There's a lot more very small towns than there are very large towns, right? And very few conurbations as opposed to hamlets or something, right? But on the other end of this, as the size of these settlements get larger, their populations get larger, you're going to see greater amounts and greater kinds of services, right? For example, you might have a arena of sorts in even in a small town or a village, right? You might have a football stadium, but it might be like a high school football, we wouldn't really say stadium, like a high school football field with benches and things like that. While a larger city is going to contain like a legit stadium, right? Like our new Raiders stadium, right? You're not going to find that in a village or small town or something, right? You need the population threshold that can sort of support something that size. Okay, so finally we can talk about a couple other things here, all right? We have world cities and mega cities as our final sort of things we're going to define. A megacity, put simply, just refers to any single city with more than 10 million inhabitants. And we'll discuss some of the issues specific to megacities in another lecture. World cities may or may not be megacities. Oftentimes they are, but they're mostly defined by their sort of global influence and power, right? Like the definition here, powerful cities that control a disproportionately high level of the world's economic, political, and cultural activities. For example, London, New York City, Tokyo are all considered, in particularly, alpha world cities because they are all major media hubs, the center of influential stock exchanges and financial institutions, the city headquarters of major corporations, or even international organizations like the UN, right? The United Nations has one of its headquarters in New York City. In general, world or global cities are known as such, like I said, because of the distinct role they play in the global economy and their ability to exert influence in media and culture well beyond their city or even national borders. As you move down the hierarchy to like beta and gamma world cities, the same characteristics are in play, right? These are places that have kind of a larger influence than maybe their population might suggest in cultural, financial, political areas, but just to an increasingly smaller degree. Sometimes geographers define a city as a world city because it exerts like a particularly strong influence in a certain region or area, like Dubai in the Middle East or Singapore in Southeast Asia, Sydney in the South Pacific, but also sometimes geographers give world city status to cities that excel in particular fields or industries. For example, Amsterdam as a kind of financial center, much more powerful than its size and population might suggest, or Milan in Italy as a center of global fashion, but not a particularly giant city in its own right, but is sort of like, the headquarters, right, of fashionable people. So, okay. That about wraps up this lecture and gets us started in our study of cities and services by kind of laying out a few basic definitions and kind of giving us a baseline understanding of what a city is, what an urban area is, and some of the terms related to their influence and growth, all right? We will build on this in future lectures as we wrap up the Human Geography course here, all right? I hope that helped you guys, and talk to you again soon.